before we realized those existed. We needed to have pretty good microscopes, which we had by the late 1800s, good light microscopes, similar to the ones we're working with in the lab. And studies done then were showing that we actually had a difference between males and females, at least with humans and other mammals, regarding some of the chromosomes. Notably, females have these two large X chromosomes, as they came to be called. Males have one large X and one little, runny, scrubby little Y chromosome. So in that case, who has more DNA, men or women?
Both.
Women. Yeah, several percent more. The X chromosome is one of the largest chromosomes we have, and women get a double copy of that. So that's not how sex determination works in every other species. With mammals and with fruit flies, which have been very important for genetic studies, that's how it works. But sometimes this sort of thing is switched around. They actually, in this case, use different designations for the chromosomes, but essentially the other way around. And with some, you'll end up getting other environmental conditions determining the sex, like the temperature that an egg is incubating at may determine whether you get a male or a female. So it's not like every species does it the same way that we do. Now, the X and Y that we have, they cross over a little bit during meiosis. So if you're a male and you're producing sperm, there is some limited crossing over between the X and Y, but there are some genes that really do not cross over onto the X. So part of the Y stays in the male lineage all the way down, stays with the Y, and doesn't get switched ever over to an X chromosome. Now, you'll have then sex determination working like so. Female is always passing on an X chromosome. Male's passing on either an X or a Y in a sperm. He has the two sex chromosomes. We do the meiosis reductive division, and you end up with one or the other of those normally in a sperm. There are some abnormalities that we'll look at a little later, but typically it will be this way. And if there's a Y chromosome, that makes you a boy. You otherwise turn out as a girl. Well, that Y chromosome isn't very big. You have around 20,000 or so genes in the human genome, and the Y just has a very small number of those. And in fact, you can survive without a Y chromosome just fine. You can survive having just one X chromosome and no other sex chromosome, and you'll get some abnormal development, but you'll certainly grow up into a living person. Most of this Y chromosome that is not really essential for a person's life. The one thing that it does have is this SRY gene. That is this basically a section of this chromosome that makes you turn out male if you have this sex chromosome. If you have a Y chromosome, then during fetal development, around week 7 or so, not very long after fertilization, this gene activates if you have a Y chromosome, and it triggers the development of testes. And then testes, in turn, start making testosterone, and testosterone guides male development. If you don't have a Y chromosome, and you don't have an SRY gene, then you automatically develop a speed color. And the way we think of it is that female development is the default pathway. That's the pathway all of us are on, early on in our development. But then you get about 7 weeks into development, and half of us take this left turn into maleness instead. Otherwise, everybody would just continue developing on the female line. So if you have the SRY gene, you have a Y chromosome, you make testes, otherwise you make ovaries. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's a way to start off thinking about it. So that's basically what the Y chromosome is for. It makes you into a boy if you have one. Otherwise, the X chromosome is way bigger and way more important. It is one of the largest chromosomes we have. It has around 2,000 genes out of the 20,000 or so that we have. That's a big number of them that's on this one chromosome. And you must have at least one X chromosome to survive. No one would ever make it through pregnancy and to birth if they didn't have at least one X chromosome. So you've got genes on the X chromosome that really aren't having to do with femaleness exactly. Most of them are dealing with things that everybody needs, like, for instance, ability to clot blood or having color vision. Those are things that involve genes that are on the X chromosome. And those don't have anything to do with sex. So these genes on the X chromosome are used in everybody. So again, we go through the sex determination. I don't know why I had that up there again. Sometimes, though, doesn't go according to plan. Now and then, there are these intersex situations, and there's a lot of ways that can happen. I'm just going to show you two of them. This is certainly an interesting topic, and I'm not kind of an expert on this, but I know a little bit about some situations, and so we can talk about those. Here's one situation that can cause it, and actually I sort of referred to this on your last test. This idea that if a person didn't have the correct receptors for testosterone, what could happen in the person's development. It's not enough to make the testosterone, which would be coming from the testes. It's not enough to do that. You also have to have it having an effect on the cells. The cells have proteins which are encoded by their own genes, and those are receptors for testosterone. If the receptors either aren't there or they are misformed somehow, the testosterone might arrive at a cell and have no effect on it. In that case, what would happen based on what we were seeing about default female pathway? What happens if these receptors aren't working? How would a person probably develop? Would be pretty feminized. And if it's complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, that's the most extreme form of this. And in that case, you develop with a female form, and actually you don't have any idea that you actually had a Y chromosome. So that's a situation where we say someone is 46XY, but a female, outwardly looking female. And there are other versions, less severe of that, but then other things too, involving this chimerism. That's the other one we'll look at. And this is the idea that you have the body being a mosaic where different parts have different genetics. Some could have male genetics, some could have female. So let's look at both of these. Here, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. If you saw these people, you'd probably say they're girls, right? So imagine you've got a girl who is maybe 15, and her mother's getting concerned because she still hasn't started having periods. And mother takes the girl, her daughter, to mom's gynecologist and says, here, I want you to check Susie out. I'm concerned she hasn't started having periods yet. Doctor checks her out, does some more tests, and he comes back and says, well, actually, Susie, you were supposed to be a boy. Imagine hearing that. You're in your teens and the doctor tells you that. I mean, what does that do to a person? Talk about scrambling your sense of yourself. But that's what happens. What we get is incomplete female development. If somebody has one X chromosome and then a Y chromosome, which is basically having no effect, it's essentially not doing the job of triggering male development, and that's because the testosterone receptors are not functioning. So the testosterone is having no effect. There are testes, they're internal, and they're secreting testosterone, but it's not really doing anything. The result is that we get mostly female development. It's not complete. Internally, you have the testes, for instance, and there's no uterus. Basically, the vagina just hits a dead end, and there's no uterus, no ovaries. So someone in this situation is going to be sterile. there are other complications. There's a greater risk of testicular cancer with those internal testes. But overall, this is something which is definitely an intersex situation, and it's got to come as an enormous shock to anybody who has it. Usually not noticed until puberty because you don't start having periods. Without having a uterus, that's not going to happen. There are other versions of this that are less severe. But here's the other one, chimerism. Okay, so we've got this figure out in mythology where we've got the idea of different animals all grafted together, some sort of a hybrid creature where it's a dragon, a lion, a goat, and so forth. There's different versions of this out in mythology, but we've all heard about things like this. The idea of a centaur where you've got maybe a human torso and head on a horse's body, again, would be a version of this. Well, what can happen is that it's kind of the opposite of having fraternal twins. How do we get non-identical twins? Like maybe having a brother and a sister born at the same time. How does that happen?
Two separate eggs were fertilized. Oh,
That was hearing it?
two separate eggs were fertilized.
Yes, two separate eggs. So usually the ovaries take turns. Each takes a month off. Now and then, they both put down eggs at the same time. And they can both get fertilized. Well, imagine you've got something where maybe two different sperm come up, they're going up the two oviducts, both eggs get fertilized, and now these embryos go down and implant in the uterus. That's what will lead us toward having, say, two non-identical twins. That's just like having, a brother or a sister that's the same age as you exactly, born at the same time. Well, now and then, those embryos will come down into the uterus and they actually fuse together. And you get one hybrid embryo where it has some genes from one embryo and some from the other. And then it goes on developing as one. In this case, we have a person where different parts of this person's body were either encoding much lighter skin or much darker skin. That could happen with some of the random rearrangements in crossing over. So you've got, in this case, though, very different skin tones, and that's resulted from having one of those original embryos encoding these darker patches, and the other one encoding the lighter patches. Same idea over here and here. Well, imagine that those embryos were of different sexes. They got fertilized by a sperm carrying an X and a different sperm carrying a Y. So you had male and female embryos fused together. You could get any number of arrangements coming out, including a body that's got a testis on one side and an ovary on the other. You could think of any arrangement that can happen in such a situation. So that's another way to the intersex, actually being a chimera, being a hybrid of person, where different parts of your body have different genetics. And we sometimes will see that show up with different eye colors. These cats, and with this girl here. That's not the only way to get different eye colors, but it's a way to do it. Some discussion that I read on this suggested that in her case, if she was coming from a family where they had a history of a lot of twins, then there'd be a good chance that she actually resulted from twin embryos fusing together. So just the idea of having the separate eye colors doesn't prove it. This could be from a sporadic mutation that just caused the different eye color as one embryo was developing, but it's a possibility. So you could see, I think, where you can get an intersex situation where a person has some very complex stuff going on as a result of fusion of embryos. There are a lot of other things that can happen involving hormonal imbalances at critical points in development. But this overall subject is something that you can read up on. There is a book that I read, it was from the King County Library, called, I believe, Between. Maybe that's the title of the book. It's a short one, fairly easy to read, going into a lot of case histories of different versions of things that can happen that basically go wrong in the development, leading to unusual outcomes. So you might check that out. I thought it was a good book on this subject. Questions for me on this? All right, well, let's look at some other things here that can happen. And we're talking here about, well, in this case, fruit flies. This is the way a normal eye looks on a fruit fly. They normally have red eyes, and of course it's a compound eye. Now and then, usually with a male, we can find, say, an unusual mutant one where it's white instead of red. Scientists doing these fruit fly studies for genetics back in the early 1900s noticed now and then when they were looking at a big population of fruit flies, they'd see something different about one. Maybe it would have really short wings or have unusual looking antennas or a small sized body or some different color with the eyes. Maybe the eye was purple or some other color. In this case, white eye. This is something that turns out to be connected to the X chromosome in the fruit flies, and it was a way to study inheritance involving genes on the X chromosome because it gives you a visible marker of what's happening with those genes. So you go through this breeding study, starting with a female that's normal. Female has normal genetics, and she has 2 normal X chromosomes. The male with the white eyes that you see up there, he has a normal Y, but then he has this mutant X. The white eye gene is being shown there with the white on the X chromosome. This is how we now understand what was going on when they did these breeding experiments. If you mated the white-eyed male with the red-eyed female, all of the offspring had red eyes. They all had the normal red eyes. The red-eyed trait actually was dominant over the white-eyed trait. And what we're getting in the case of these females is they're always getting a normal X from their mother. What are these females getting from their father? An X or a Y? An X, and that's the mutant X. So what can we say about all of these females? They're all heterozygous for the eye color gene. They all have a dominant red and a recessive white version. What about these males? What did they get from their mother? What came from mom there? A normal X. And from dad? Normal Y. So these are totally normal. These are what we call carriers. They're hybrids. They all carry the white eye version of the gene, and there it is. Here we're looking at the gametes that would be produced by this generation. These females, when they are producing eggs, half the eggs are normal and half have the white eye version. He's making sperm, they're all normal. And we end up mating these together, basically mating these brothers and sisters together, but this is what we get, is this unusual looking Punnett square. Yes?
Is there an obvious reason why the males have the mutations?
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a second. It is basically just a matter of math. But yes, we will look at that in a second. Here, this mating Punnett square, we get 4 different outcomes in here. These sperm, would you say these are normal sperm? Yes, they are. Some with Y's, some with X's. This is leaving out all the other chromosomes. We're just focusing on the sex chromosomes here. These eggs, are they all normal? Half of them are, half are not. We produce a female here. Is she normal? Yes, 2 normal X's. Male here, what about him? Normal. What about her? She's a carrier. 1 mutant and 1 normal. So she looks like her mom. And this one,
No.
That's a mutant male. So this trait jumped and skipped a generation. It went from a male to disappearing to coming back in a male. That's similar to what happened with the flower color with Mendel's peas, where the white color disappeared in the hybrids and then came back later on. But this is something where that trait is mostly showing up in the males, and there is a reason for that. With these sex-linked characteristics involving mutations with the X chromosome, usually we're talking with the important diseases that affect humans, we're talking about them mostly affecting the males. Well, imagine it's a rare mutation. This is where the numbers game comes in. If it's a rare mutation, for a male to have it, how many copies does he need to inherit? Just one. If it's the female, how many copies does she need to inherit? Two. Well, if it's pretty rare, that's a lot more likely than having a female who got it from both her parents. That's the reason it's mostly going to be in males. We're talking about something where if it's on the X chromosome, then it's something that can be expressed just by having the one mutant copy. The female would have to get 2 mutant copies, assuming it's a recessive gene, assuming it's a recessive trait. So this is the kind of study that was done in fruit fly labs through many, many years, and that's part of the utility of fruit flies. If we tried to do the same experiment with the same controls on humans, it would probably take us 100 years to complete the breeding experiment, to go through all the generations, and all that time we would have to be keeping people captive and forcing them to mate with partners of our choosing. That would be a pretty monstrous thing to do, and we wouldn't do it. But with the fruit flies, we can do it, and we can learn information that applies to us. And all you have to do is feed them with banana once a week, and they're happy. I did a little bit with fruit flies at another school, and I was actually really happy to actually get the experience. I always wondered, how do they actually count these things? I mean, you open a jar and they're flying around the room, right? How do you actually do that? How do you work with them? Well, you keep them in a jar, and you put in, say, a piece of a banana, and you've got a lot of fruit flies in there, and they're breeding and making babies. And there's a substance, an anesthetic they call fly nap. And all you do is take like a cotton swab, dip it in fly nap, and then slip that into the jar. 5 minutes later, they're all asleep. And then you can just put them onto a little dish and look at it with a small magnifier, and it's easy to tell males and females apart. And so all you do is take a tiny little brush and you just sweep them into piles, males, females, or long wings, short wings, counting up whatever characteristics you want. And then when you're done, you just put them back in the jar, and after a few minutes they wake up and they're happy. So they're incredibly easy to work with. Imagine trying to do a similar result with similar science using people. There's so much wrong with that it's lucky we don't have to. So with the studies with the fruit flies, we learned a lot about things that apply to some important human diseases. In general, imagine this. Imagine we've got a rare mutation. It's showing up here as the red X. Occasionally, this gene is floating around in the population. Here we have a mother who's a carrier for it. She's normal, outwardly normal, but she's carrying this recessive, harmful version of the gene. She's passing it on to half of her kids. Her daughters who get that gene still look normal, but they also are carriers. And then the sons who get that gene are affected. Half of her children are totally normal. The others are abnormal, as we saw with flies. Who is he? Well, she could, of course, pass it on in the same path that her mom has done. What about him? Who is he going to give it to?
Daughter.
His daughters. Can he give that to his sons?
No.
No, never. So this is something where you have a gene preferentially jumping from affected son to carrier daughter back to affected son. That's the sort of path this can follow. And again, the fact that we don't see very many affected females is because they would have to get it from both parents. Now, there is one fairly common sex-linked thing that's out there where we do get a fair number of affected females, and that's with color blindness. Red-green color blindness is where if you have it, you might see that scene, and if you have normal color vision, you would see this scene. It basically means that you're still able to see some colors, but not as many, and reds and greens are difficult to tell apart. So this is something that is connected to the X chromosome, and overwhelmingly it affects males. So in here, does anybody know anybody who's colorblind? I do? Okay, who's that?
My uncle and his mom.
Uncle, okay?
Yeah.
Quickly
No.
related.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. So who's that? Male, female?
Male.
Okay. Were there others? Yeah. He, yeah. So now and then I'll have somebody say my sister is, and I go, you run my story. The fact is there are some colorblind females because this is fairly common in the population. About 8% of males have this mutation. There's a lot of males out there who have problems with color vision. With that percentage of people being affected, now and then you do get a female where she got it from both parents and she's affected too, but still the males greatly outnumber the females. Now, here's one that's way more serious. Color vision, that's more of a nuisance, but this is really a matter of, well, death. Here's what normal muscle fibers should look like if they're magnified about 50,000 times. Highly organized arrangement of your muscles. This is what happens if you have Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The muscles start off developing okay, but eventually they fall apart and collapse. That looks to me like a house of cards falling down. The muscles lose their strength. Eventually the person suffocates, can't even breathe anymore by about age 20. Before that, he's in a wheelchair and becoming just less and less able to move at all. So this is an X-linked condition where it's passed from a carrier mother to an affected and doomed son. So that is passed on mother to son, and it doesn't get past the son. The son basically has no possibility of being a father. By the time he's 10 or so, he's probably already in a wheelchair and getting worse and worse and worse, and basically physically unable of making a baby, unable to. So this is basically a dead end, literally, when it gets into the boy. But imagine the guilt that a mother has to feel if she's got a boy who is dying from this disease and she learns that it came from her. That has to be just a crushing guilt for a mother. And right now we have no cure for that. It's a horrible disease. So this is one which is a lot more rare, luckily. We don't want a lot of this one around, but it's a terrible, terrible outcome when it does happen. So that is sex-linked. Now, we can look at parentage, looking at pedigrees, and this is just a basic schematic for one, taking us through 3 generations, going from grandparents to their children to their grandchildren. And the way you read this is that you've got females with the kind of curvy shape, males with the angular shape. Somebody came up with those symbols. And so you're able to tell males and females. If it's lined up like this, that represents a mating. And a mating in this case that produced a daughter. Here's a different mating between these 2 people producing a son. These 2 then mated, and they had 6 kids in this order. So they're numbered in the order that they were produced. And in this case, 2 of these kids have some sort of condition. It might be a serious disease, or it might be just something like having red hair. You know, we're not saying in this case, but in this case, 2 were affected. So, do we know anything about what was going on? Like, could this be a sex-linked condition that we're talking about? Something on the X chromosome? Probably not, since we have a male affected. You know, we don't have much data, but it's unlikely that it would be sex-linked if it's affecting both boys and girls. You could study that over more and probably come up with an idea of how a thing is being passed on and how it's showing up in these 2. But with this, here's a historical one that had a lot of significance in Europe, going through the 1800s up into the 1900s, looking at the royal families of Europe. You had Queen Victoria of England. She was born in 1819. She has lots of kids. She had 9 kids. This only shows 7 of them for some reason. But she had these nine kids, and she was determined to get them married into other royal families. They had just finished up with the very long period of the Napoleonic Wars, and she was hoping to prevent something like that, massive warfare in Europe, and thought that if all these royal families were married to each other, then they would be less likely to want to go to war with each other. That was the theory. And so she has these kids, and she, for instance, gets Alice and has her, no, it's not Alice, it's a different one, but gets one daughter married off into the German royal family, another with the Russians, and so various other families here that these children were marrying into, and hemophilia starts showing up. That's the famous bleeding disorder. You get an injury to a joint, and it just keeps swelling up with blood, causing massive joint damage. If you get a serious cut, you could bleed to death. So that's a very bad inherited illness, and it originated with her in this case. She was a carrier for it. She probably got a mutated X chromosome from one of her parents, and so she had a mutant X, where a gene that's affecting blood clotting, which is on the X chromosome, was faulty in her. Again, it probably came from one of her parents. She had normal health. She was a carrier. But then she had all these kids, and she passed this gene along to, in this case, 3 out of 7 of her kids shown on this diagram. Notice, daughters didn't have the disease. They were carriers like mom. This is following the sort of model we were describing for sex-linked inheritance. Beatrice, the same way. A daughter, she's unaffected. How do we know that she was a carrier? So how do we know that?
The colored in circle.
She had 2 sons that had the disease. It came through her to get there. We know that Victoria herself was a carrier because she had a son who actually had the disease right there, Leopold. So it's being passed from mother to about half of her children. And if they're daughters, their health is good, but they're carriers. If they're sons, they get the disease. Or else they don't get that X from her and they're healthy. Alice has her own big family and again passes this faulty X on to 3 of her kids. One of them, a son, gets the disease. Others, we know that they were carriers because they later had sons who had the disease. I said we couldn't do a breeding experiment to study sex-linked inheritance in humans, but the royals actually did it for us. And it did take about a century to do all this. This is covering about a century's time, but the royals really keep very close track of who mates with whom, and they control who marries whom and so on. And so they basically did an actual experiment for us, and here's the results of it. It fits with what we already understood from the fruit flies. Same model of inheritance. Well, that's a very serious disease. You definitely don't want to have it. Now, we are able to isolate a blood clotting factor from donated blood and give that to hemophiliacs. And so if you are a hemophiliac in modern times, we're able to control your blood clotting and give you closer to normal health. But back in the mid-'80s, about half of the hemophiliacs in the United States got HIV, and they died from it. We didn't have any effective treatments for HIV then, so they got AIDS and died. How come? If you were a hemophiliac, why would you get AIDS? Because they're having to go and process blood from hundreds of different donors to make the clotting factor. They had to basically separate out all these blood donations. Some of those were contaminated with HIV, and it got passed on to about half the hemophiliacs in the United States, and they died from it. So that was a terrible scandal at the time, a terrible situation as part of the AIDS crisis as it was developing. Yeah.
So does natural selection doesn't work on sex-linked?
Oh, it'll work, but natural selection is sometimes more complicated than we would think. I showed you the thing with the malaria and the sickle cell.
Mm-hmm.
So there we might look at a population like in Central Africa and think, why is it that all these people, there are so many people in the population that are carrying the sickle cell allele? Isn't that strange? Because sickle cell is a bad disease. You'd think natural selection would get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Turned out there was another reason to keep it around. So in some of these situations it may be like that, or else new mutations come along and create more copies. And that's probably what happened here, because there's no record of this anywhere up the line from Victoria. So it was probably a new mutation in one of her parents. Either one, something went wrong with the X chromosome she got from one of them, and then she passed it through the generations. So you can always create new copies of faulty genes through mutations, and that's, I think, what happened in this case. So over time, natural selection would deal with it, but then another one will pop up.
Did
And
you
that's,
see?
I think, maybe a good way to look at it. Okay.
Yeah, you made out.
Well, here's something else. If you are a female, as a lot of you are, you have the two X chromosomes, but you mostly are using just one of them in any given cell in your body. If you look into any one cell, you'll find that for the most part, the cell is only using one of those X chromosomes, not using the other one. What happens is that genes are activated on our different chromosomes, leading to production of different proteins. You want those proteins to be made in the appropriate doses. Now, if males have one X chromosome and they're activating those genes to make proteins, you would like to have females producing the same amount of proteins, because most of those genes on the X have nothing to do with, say, femaleness, and you'd expect to produce the same amounts of these different proteins that are used for other functions